Fast roping teams, jungle warfare, deep recon, silent raids, the MACV-SOG, the Black Ops unit that wasn't supposed to exist. In the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia during the height of the Vietnam War, a secret war unfolded that few knew existed at the time. It was a shadow campaign fought by an elite cadre of Americans and indigenous allies under the command of MACV-SOG Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observations Group. Formed in 1964, MACV-SOG was born from the urgent need to disrupt North Vietnamese supply lines, gather actionable intelligence, and conduct cross-border missions that conventional units could not legally or politically touch. What made SOG unique wasn't just the danger of its missions, it was the level of deniability, the techniques they employed, and how far they were willing to go behind enemy lines. At its peak, SOG was executing deep penetration recon, strategic sabotage, prisoner snatches, wiretap installations, and psychological operations, all in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam, places they weren't even supposed to be. And they did so with an audacity and stealth that redefined covert warfare. The SOG operator was a different breed. Each recon team, known by code names like RT Idaho, RT Colorado, or RT New York, was composed of 2 to 3 American Green Berets and 4 to 8 indigenous fighters, often Montagnards, Nungs, or other highly trained local tribesmen. These men would be inserted by helicopters into the densest parts of enemy territory, sometimes just a kilometer or two from known NVA base camps. The jungle was thick, humid, and alive with movement. The NVA weren't just present, they dominated the region. MACV-SOG's job was to slip past their eyes, conduct the mission, and escape without a trace. Mission planning was obsessively detailed. Every operation began with an intel brief that often relied on aerial photos, intercepted comms, and debriefs from prior missions. The recon teams then built custom loadouts. Every bullet, ration, and radio was weighed against speed, noise, and weight. Black fatigues were standard. Face paint and camo netting were applied to blend into the thick canopy. Weapons varied, but suppressed CAR-15, Swedish Ks, sawed-off shotguns, and even captured AKs were common. Everything had to be small, lethal, and fast. Insertion was usually by King B helicopters, operated by South Vietnamese pilots. These choppers would skim treetop level, often drawing fire during ingress. Teams would rope in or jump into LZs no larger than a car. The goal was silence and speed. Once on the ground, they went dark. Radios remained silent except for scheduled comms checks. Movement was slow, methodical. The jungle was their enemy too. Leeches, heat stroke, and jungle rot were constant threats. But the greatest danger came from detection. The moment a recon team was spotted, they were hunted. NVA counter-recon units were specifically trained to track and kill SOG teams. The moment a trail was broken or a team left behind evidence, a cigarette butt, a snapped twig, they were marked. SOG teams often found themselves running from battalion-size elements, dodging sweep lines, doubling back, and calling for extraction while under fire. One famous tactic was the cloverleaf movement. Teams would recon outward in a spiral or clover shape, always returning to their insertion point to avoid ambush. Perhaps the most high-risk missions were wiretap and prisoner snatch operations. In one operation, a SOG team inserted just outside an NVA communication hub, crawled through minefields, and installed a telephone tap. The device relayed top-level enemy comms for weeks before it was discovered. In another, an all-American team disguised as NVA infiltrated a POW camp compound. They were only yards from sleeping guards, but managed to extract a North Vietnamese officer for interrogation. These weren't just raids, they were feats of espionage wrapped in firepower. To support these missions, SOG developed cutting-edge Black Ops tactics. They pioneered the use of false trails, dragging sandbags behind them to simulate different numbers of people, or to throw off trackers. They dropped enemy ammo caches filled with sabotaged rounds that would explode in NVA rifles. They used psychological warfare, including faked NVA broadcasts and ghost radio signals, to confuse and demoralize enemy units. Some of their deception campaigns, like Operation Eldest Son, sowed distrust between NVA troops and their own equipment. SOG also mastered escape and evasion. Each man carried an emergency extraction beacon, often buried in the jungle before insertion and activated if the team had to split. Air assets, including Air Force Covey-FX and fast movers, were always on standby. A team in contact could call for a prairie fire emergency, triggering a massive extraction effort. Gunships, A-1 Sky Raiders and fighter jets would swarm the area, laying down covering fire as choppers swooped in to extract teams under fire. Entire battles were fought to pull out a single six-man team. And still, many didn't make it. The casualty rate among SOG recon teams was astronomical. Some teams were overrun. Others were never heard from again, but they kept going back, often knowing full well that each mission might be their last. Their operational secrecy was so tight that even other units in Vietnam didn't know what SOG did. They wore no unit insignia. Their missions were scrubbed from logs. Many operators' families didn't know the full extent of their service until decades later. What MACV-SOG accomplished in those early years laid the groundwork for everything that came after. The techniques they developed, deep recon, black insertions, deniable missions, and psychological operations, would directly inform the TTPS, tactics, techniques, procedures, of future Tier 1 units. Delta Force, created in the late 1970s, adopted SOG's debrief cycles, their use of indigenous assets, and their reconnaissance doctrines. Even in today's JSOC operations from Iraq to Syria, you can see the ghost of SOG in every rooftop landing and every silent raid. By late 1966, MACV-SOG mission profile shifted from purely reconnaissance to include aggressive interdiction of the enemy's logistics lifeline, the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This jungle highway stretching from North Vietnam through Laos and Cambodia was the artery pumping troops, weapons, and supplies into South Vietnam. Disrupting it wasn't just a tactical need, it was strategic survival. SOG's mandate evolved into a blunt but invisible tool. Enter the trail zones, destroy everything of value, and vanish before the enemy could catch them. These missions required a new kind of Black Ops warfare stealth laced with sabotage, speed sharpened by sabotage. Small recon teams, often just 6 to 8 men strong, would slip across the border into Laos or Cambodia, where they would spend days shadowing truck convoys, watching trail intersections, and identifying choke points. Their gear was tailored for demolition: claymore mines, day cords, C4 bricks, grenade launchers, and hand-placed directional charges. Every pound carried had to earn its keep. Most missions aimed to lay traps along trails, ambushes that would either destroy NVA supply units or force them to reroute, buying critical time for American and ARVN forces inside South Vietnam. One of the most dangerous assignments was placing road cratering charges on narrow jungle paths. Operators would dig beneath hard-packed dirt and place buried charges timed with pressure fuses or remote triggers, then pull back to watch. In one such operation near Chapone, a SOG team blew a fuel convoy using a multi-stage ambush. The first blast tore open the road, the second hit the tanker trucks, and the third, a final set of claymores raked the survivors. The jungle exploded in flames. Operators watched through night vision scopes, counting enemy dead and vehicles destroyed. Moments later, they were moving again, knowing reinforcements were already being scrambled to intercept them. Sabotage wasn't always about explosives. In a mission recorded near the Bankari Pass, a recon team inserted at night and crept into an NVA supply station camouflaged inside a small village. While 2 Americans overwatched from the tree line, Montagnard team members snuck in and contaminated rice sacks with powdered laxatives and spoiled meat extract. The goal was to cripple entire platoons with illness. The team slipped away unnoticed, but SIGINT reported a sharp drop in radio traffic from the unit days later. They had succeeded without firing a shot. Communication disruption was another specialty. SOGG teams used field wiretaps and demolition to great effect. In one mission, a team led by a seasoned 1-0 tapped into a major comms cable near the Mujia Pass. The cable, buried and armored, was carefully uncovered, spliced, and fitted with a listening device that fed enemy traffic to Covey aircraft above. The intel flowed for nearly 72 hours before NVA engineers discovered the breach and sent patrols to flush out the intruders. The team escaped under fire, zigzagging through gullies and karst formations while calling for extraction. King B helicopters swooped in low as gunships sprayed the ridgelines behind them. MACV-SOG developed innovative sabotage techniques specifically for the dense jungle environment. In certain operations, teams used delayed fuses or even battery-powered timers to hit targets hours after exfil. One method involved tying plastic explosives to key bridge supports or culverts, setting a timer, and retreating across the border before the blast. This not only bought distance, but denied the NVA a quick response. On several occasions, enemy engineers returned to find critical bridges or road sections completely destroyed with no trace of who had done it. Ambush missions were arguably the most harrowing. SOG teams would sometimes spend 24 to 48 hours lying in wait near trail bends or river crossings, camouflaged to the point of invisibility, waiting for NVA units to pass. When the moment came, they would spring the ambush using claymores and machine guns, inflict maximum casualties in seconds, then melt into the jungle. One team recounted an ambush in 1968 where they took down a platoon-sized column, seized maps and documents, and disappeared before enemy QRFs arrived. The documents revealed new infiltration routes and future attacks intel that was passed immediately to field commanders in South Vietnam. These missions demanded total discipline. Noise discipline, light discipline, and route masking were sacred. Teams would never walk on trails. They moved parallel, sometimes through swamps or ridgelines to avoid contact. They booby-trapped their own back trails if they had to bug out. They wanted the enemy to pay for every step. Every team practiced exfiltration drills religiously. If contact was made, the mission flipped instantly into survival mode. Extraction zones were never static. Teams would mark alternate LZs with infrared strobes visible only to Covey aircraft. In several cases, teams had to fight for their LZ, calling in A-1 Sky Raiders and F-4 Phantoms to bomb the jungle, while Slicks came in under fire. One legendary story involved a recon team near Atapu in Laos. The team inserted deep, expecting a 48-hour recon, but discovered a massive logistics node. Instead of simply observing, the 1-0 called in B-52 coordinates, relayed through an airborne FAC. Just before the arc light strike, the team laid directional charges and claymores along the retreat route, knowing that survivors would flee into the jungle. As the bombs rained down, the SOG team ambushed retreating forces, then evaded through a dry creek bed for over 10 kilometers to their secondary LZ. They made it out with film, maps, and bloodied uniforms, but no losses. Many of these stories never made it into public record. MACV-SOG operated in such secrecy that even their awards were often given under false unit designations. Their missions in Laos and Cambodia violated international law, which is why they had no support from conventional ground forces and why their presence was never acknowledged. If captured, they had standing orders to claim they were contractors or lost South Vietnamese troops. SOG teams carried no ID. Many wore captured enemy gear. Their radios were encoded, their maps were hand-drawn, and their uniforms didn't match. But their effectiveness was undeniable. Between 1967 and 1970, MACV-SOG teams sabotaged hundreds of trail segments, destroyed convoys, intercepted comms, and disrupted the flow of men and weapons into the south. For every trail cratered or bridge destroyed, entire battalions were delayed. For every convoy ambushed or supply depot ruined, a battle in South Vietnam was reshaped, and they did it with fewer than 1,000 operators at any given time. Sabotage wasn't just part of SOG's mission, it was a philosophy. To them, the best kill was one that didn't need a bullet. The most valuable victory was the enemy starving, stranded, or retreating before the fight even began. And with every trail destroyed, every convoy vaporized, and every bridge collapsed under shadowy hands, SOG proved that a war could be fought not just in battles, but in every quiet moment between them. By 1968, MACV-SOG focus turned toward one of its most elusive and dangerous targets, the enemy's brain. Deep within Laos and Cambodia, beyond the reach of conventional firepower, North Vietnamese headquarters elements operated in secrecy, commanding troop movements, orchestrating logistics, and coordinating large-scale offensives into South Vietnam. These hidden command centers were not just buildings, they were networks of bunkers, relay stations, hardened communication points, and protected corridors. Finding them was like chasing smoke through the jungle. Destroying them required an entirely new level of precision and audacity. SOG recon teams were tasked with the nearly impossible: locate, identify, and relay the exact position of these mobile HQs, sometimes within shouting distance of the enemy, and extract without being seen. These missions weren't about enemy body counts or cratering roads. They were about listening, watching, and staying alive long enough to transmit the information. The reward was immense. If a command node could be verified and targeted, it could trigger a B-52 arc light strike or a fast mover package capable of decapitating an entire offensive chain. The jungle along the Mugia and Ban Karai passes became prime hunting grounds. Intel suggested that multiple enemy regimental and division-level headquarters rotated through these areas in hardened underground facilities. SOG teams inserted with the goal of detecting patterns, supply porters making repeated trips, radio traffic spikes, vehicle noises, and guard routines. Teams would lay up for days, camouflaged into the jungle floor, barely moving, watching through optics as enemy officers met under tarps or passed documents. Even the act of counting porters or listening to message runners could be a breakthrough. One recon mission near Muang Nong in 1969 remains infamous. A team of 6 inserted under darkness, dropped 15 kilometers from a suspected NVA regimental HQ. Within hours of landing, they picked up signs, radio antennae strung through trees, fresh trail cuts, and oddly uniform foot traffic. They set up an LPOP, listening post, observation post, within 300 meters of a small clearing and began logging activity. What they witnessed over the next 36 hours confirmed their worst fears. Senior officers arriving under escort, heavy communications usage, and an array of guards rotating in shifts. The team attempted to call in an airstrike, but were told to confirm visual ID of a regimental commander before release. The 1-0, using a low-light scope, managed to capture images of a distinctive uniform and overheard a conversation referencing planned movements into South Vietnam. This was the break command needed. Within 6 hours, B-52s flattened the area in waves. The team, now compromised by patrolling enemy troops, had to extract under extreme duress. 2 were wounded in the breakout, and they evaded for nearly 24 hours before being lifted by King B exfil, burning the last of their smokes and claymores to keep pursuit at bay. Many missions didn't get that lucky. In areas like Chapone or the A Shau Valley's western ridge, SOG teams found themselves in zones crawling with security units designed to hunt infiltrators. One veteran recalled a mission where, after 4 days of shadowing, a courier believed to be carrying command documents. The team was ambushed by an NVA sweep patrol. They were chased for over 20 kilometers, forced to cross 2 rivers, and abandoned most of their gear. They made it out with only a blood-stained notebook and a memory card. The notebook later revealed coordinates of fallback HQ sites for enemy battalions. What made these missions particularly brutal was the terrain and enemy counterintelligence. Command nodes weren't marked with signs. They were hidden beneath thatched huts, buried in hillsides, or mobile entirely. The jungle worked against recon teams, canopy cover blocked air support, rain and mist rendered optics nearly useless. In some cases, teams resorted to planting seismic sensors or small repeater nodes, devices that could passively track movement or radio emissions even after the team exfiltrated. These black boxes would later feed data back to airborne listeners, creating long-term surveillance networks. In one mission deep inside Cambodia, a SOG team inserted via low-level halo drop, gliding into a suspected HQ zone where multiple NVA units had recently vanished from US radar. The team split into 2 elements. One set up a decoy trail to draw security patrols, while the other crawled into an abandoned hut where they found fragments of documents and half-burned field maps. They called in a Covey FAC to verify potential strike zones, but the jungle made targeting impossible. Instead, the team planted time delay charges and motion sensors, then exfiltrated at dawn using a pre-positioned canoe hidden in the reeds. Days later, sensor alerts confirmed renewed activity. The area was later hit with a multi-platform airstrike. No bodies were recovered, but SIGINT confirmed loss of radio contact with 2 enemy battalions. Every successful recon mission brought a temporary advantage. Each failed mission carried immense cost. Entire teams were sometimes wiped out, caught in ambushes after their positions were compromised by trackers or dogs. Some operators were captured and disappeared. Others had to be extracted under withering fire, leaving behind fallen teammates. But they kept going. The mission demanded it. Without their eyes and ears, command had no ability to target the hidden architecture of the enemy. To support these high-risk missions, MACV-SOG developed advanced camouflage kits, deceptive trail techniques, and drone-like bird call transmitters. Operators trained to identify subtle terrain features, crushed grass indicating repeated movement, condensation trails on brush revealing hidden storage, or unnatural silence pointing to enemy presence. Some teams planted false footprints in different directions to mislead NVA scouts. They used broken mirror flashes to redirect aircraft without radios. One team even lured a patrol away by triggering their own tripwire traps and doubling back along a stream bed. When a team confirmed a headquarters location, The clock started ticking. Every hour increased the chance of detection or compromise. Fast movers were often scrambled from Thailand or Da Nang, and timing had to be perfect. The operator on the ground would lace the target using early IR pointers or mark it with smoke, sometimes getting within 100 meters of enemy command tents to ensure accuracy. During one raid, a team coordinated 3 strike waves, watching as enemy command structures were obliterated while they lay hidden less than 500 meters away, documenting blast effects through lens filters. These were surgical missions with no margin for error. They weren't raids, they weren't ambushes. They were the spear point of strategic intelligence gathering in an era with no satellites, no real-time drone feeds, and no GPS. Every click was measured by instinct and practiced silence. Every face in the jungle could be the last they ever saw. And yet they moved patiently, dangerously, always forward. In Part 4, we'll follow MACV-SOG into one of the war's most psychologically taxing arenas: prisoner snatches, body recovery missions, and intelligence extractions, the rarest and most politically volatile operations of the secret war. There were missions so rare, so delicate, and so politically volatile that only the most trusted and experienced MACV-SOG teams were ever assigned to them. These were not missions of sabotage or reconnaissance. These were prisoner snatches, body recovery missions, and intelligence extractions operations that required equal parts ruthlessness and restraint, and where the cost of failure could extend beyond the battlefield and into international headlines. They were as close as a soldier in Vietnam could come to espionage without wearing a suit. By 1969, intelligence coming out of Laos and Cambodia painted a chilling picture. Key enemy figures were operating just beyond the border, organizing offensives, managing supply chains, and coordinating with external advisors. These were not frontline commanders, but the brains of the enemy war effort. Capturing one alive, interrogating him, or recovering documentation from his person could yield intelligence worth more than a dozen successful raids. SOG teams began targeting these individuals in highly classified operations that often had to be carried out without any trace or acknowledgement. One such mission began with aerial surveillance and SIGINT intercepts, suggesting that a mid-level NVA intelligence officer was frequenting a relay post near Ban Bok, just inside Laos. The officer traveled with a small entourage, usually 3 or 4 bodyguards, and changed his route often. A 6-man recon team was tasked not with observing him but capturing him. They inserted under darkness, moved into an ambush position, and waited for over 30 hours in heavy rain. When the target finally appeared, the team triggered a non-lethal claymore, stunning the group. In the ensuing chaos, they subdued the officer using blunt trauma and zip cuffs. His guards were either killed or fled. The team exfiltrated with the unconscious officer on a makeshift stretcher, pursued by a reaction force. The intelligence recovered from his debrief directly led to the exposure of a fuel depot 10 kilometers south, which was later destroyed in a coordinated airstrike. Body recovery missions were even more emotionally charged. These weren't just about strategy, they were about bringing home fellow operators who had disappeared into the jungle. When a team was presumed killed but left no confirmed KIA or recovery, SOG would often mount a retrieval mission, either to recover remains or confirm status. These were deeply personal, high-risk operations with zero margin for error. In one of the most haunting examples, a team inserted into the area where RT Nevada had disappeared 2 weeks earlier. The terrain was mountainous, heavily patrolled, and choked with elephant grass. The team used drone-like bird call devices to mask their movement and moved only at dusk or dawn. After 3 days of slow movement, they located a half-buried rucksack and shredded uniform fragments. Near a dry creek bed, they found 2 shallow graves. Using entrenching tools, they recovered partial remains, tags, and a personal item, a silver Zippo with the engraved initials of the 10. They marked the site for aerial pickup and extracted under the cover of pre-planned artillery suppression. The bodies were later identified and returned to their families, an act that became sacred within the SOG community. The psychological toll of these missions was immense. Capturing someone alive in enemy territory meant keeping them silent, secured, and hidden, while simultaneously preparing for extraction. Teams trained in advanced restraint techniques, sedation protocols, and how to move prisoners silently over rough terrain. Some missions involved knocking out targets with blunt strikes or injected sedatives, then binding them in camouflage stretchers that blended into the jungle floor. During one such mission, a prisoner awoke during exfil and began screaming in Vietnamese. The team had to knock him unconscious again with a rifle butt to avoid detection. Minutes later, enemy search teams passed within 50 meters of their hiding position. Interrogations, when they occurred, were conducted at forward operating bases with interpreters and intelligence officers standing by. SOG operators rarely handled the questioning themselves, but the preparation and extraction were their responsibility. The intelligence gained from these prisoners often included infiltration routes, planned attacks, unit strength estimates, and methods of supply distribution. In several instances, it led directly to successful airstrikes or interdictions that saved hundreds of lives downrange. MACV-SOG also carried out psychological warfare operations as an extension of their intelligence efforts. They planted forged documents, dropped altered propaganda, and spread rumors among captured enemies to seed distrust. In one unique operation, a captured courier was fed false information and then released near an NVA patrol route with a planted map. Days later, that map led enemy units into an ambush that destroyed a supply convoy. Some of the rarest missions involved snatching suspected foreign advisors. These missions were almost never acknowledged, even internally. Rumors swirled of encounters with Soviet or Chinese personnel advising NVA logistics groups or managing communications hubs in Cambodia. In one heavily redacted mission, a SOG team reportedly recovered documents written in Cyrillic and a radio log indicating Russian language traffic in the area. The team exfiltrated under heavy pursuit, and while no advisor was captured, the documentation led to increased surveillance and the deployment of strategic reconnaissance assets over the region. Failure in these missions wasn't just operational, it was political. If a prisoner died in custody or a mission was exposed publicly, it could cause international fallout. That's why such operations required multiple layers of deniability. Operators wore no identifying insignia. Some missions used weapons commonly carried by the enemy to avoid obvious American fingerprints. Radios used coded brevity scripts, and any visual intel was processed only at compartmentalized levels. In some cases, captured prisoners were moved through multiple FOBs before being handed over to ARVN units for final processing to maintain plausible deniability. The emotional aftermath lingered long after the extraction. Operators often reported difficulty sleeping, recurring dreams, and flashbacks. Many refused to speak about these missions for decades. Capturing a man alive in a jungle war zone, evading an enemy force while dragging his struggling body, or digging up the remains of a fallen teammate. These were memories that dug deeper than shrapnel. But they did it, again and again, not for medals, not for glory. Most of the time, their actions were never recorded in any official capacity. These were the missions that history books skipped, the ones that intelligence agencies quietly praised behind closed doors, and they were often the difference between a blind war and one guided by real, hard-won human intelligence. In Part 5, we'll examine the final phase of MACV-SOG's Vietnam operations, how they shifted into interdicting cross-border movements at scale, working with indigenous proxy forces, and laying the groundwork for the transition to post-war special operations doctrine. By 1970, the nature of MACV-SOG's war had changed. The secret war in Laos and Cambodia was no longer a purely surgical game of reconnaissance and sabotage. As U.S. strategy shifted toward Vietnamization, the pressure on SOG to interdict enemy movement at scale intensified. The North Vietnamese were pouring troops and supplies across the border in preparation for what would become their final offensives. MACV-SOG teams had to adapt fast, pivoting from precision raids to sustained border interdiction, broader coordination with indigenous proxy forces, and legacy-focused training missions. These were the twilight years of the secret war, gritty, aggressive, and deeply influential on future special operations doctrine. In early 1970, SOG launched Operation Salem House, a multi-pronged effort to sever major arteries along the Ho Chi Minh Trail using continuous recon, large-scale ambushes, and layered intelligence. The missions became more dangerous, more frequent, and often involved overlapping recon zones with multiple teams operating simultaneously. The terrain was unforgiving triple canopy jungle, cloud-choked valleys, and NVA units now heavily reinforced with armor, anti-air assets, and hardened defensive tactics. To meet the demand, SOG expanded its reliance on indigenous proxy forces. Montagnard tribesmen, Cambodian Khmer Serae, and Laotian irregulars trained under CIA programs were integrated into operations. In many cases, these fighters provided critical local knowledge, language skills, and endurance unmatched by conventional troops. SOG teams began embedding more deeply with these units, forming composite strike teams capable of operating for weeks at a time in enemy-controlled areas. These partnerships created a multiplier effect, so GWAS no longer just six-man recon teams. It was a hidden force with an entire shadow army. One mission near the Laotian border involved a composite team of 2 Green Berets and 12 Khmer Sere fighters who identified and then ambushed a column of NVA porters moving mortar rounds toward the Aisho Valley. After a 3-day stalk, they hit the convoy using synchronized claymore charges and small arms fire, killing or dispersing the enemy. Captured maps showed multiple supply points further north. Instead of exfiltrating, the team pushed deeper, calling in gunships to strike a hidden cache and marking future targets for drone-like sensor pods. The use of technology increased in these final years. SOG began deploying long-range seismic sensors, miniaturized relays, and acoustic monitors to triangulate movement along the trail. These tools allowed recon teams to spend less time exposed and more time planning strikes. One operation in late 1971 saw a team drop a string of sensors along a tributary road near Chipone. Within hours, movement data was relayed to a nearby fire base, triggering a coordinated airstrike that destroyed an NVA fuel convoy. The SOG team watched from a hilltop nearly a mile away as fireballs lit the night sky. But even with tech and proxies, the danger never abated. Enemy counter-recon tactics evolved rapidly. Tracker teams now included dogs. NVA troops began sweeping in wider arcs using noise discipline and better map intelligence. In some cases, they deployed their own version of SOG specially trained hunters designed to sniff out American teams. In response, SOG doubled down on deception. Teams planted dummy trails, used noise generators to lure pursuers, and relied more heavily on multiple fallback LZs. By mid-1972, as American involvement in Vietnam began to wind down, SOG teams took on more training and capacity-building missions. In Cambodia, they helped organize indigenous strike companies, units trained in sabotage, ambush, and intelligence gathering. These groups conducted missions independent of American oversight, using tactics learned directly from SOG. In South Vietnam, Green Berets worked alongside ARVN Rangers and SF units to refine fast rope insertions, battlefield comms, and silent extraction drills. One mission involved training a Montagnard platoon in long-range recon skills. Weeks later, that same unit led a deep penetration mission into Laos that uncovered a new logistics hub and directed artillery strikes that crippled NVA staging efforts. In this way, SOG ensured that even as their direct footprint shrank, their operational effect continued. Some of the last SOG missions were not about killing or gathering intel, but about preparing for collapse. Teams developed contingency plans for American personnel extraction, burned classified caches, and planted scorched earth protocols in key FOBs. There were training cycles devoted solely to what would happen if U.S. presence vanished overnight. Many SOG veterans remember those final years as marked by a strange duality. They were still fighting, but also bearing their own legacy. A few operations stood out in these closing chapters. One team inserted deep in Cambodia near a suspected enemy rally point. They discovered a mix of NVA and Khmer Rouge elements setting up a training camp. The team relayed intel back to command, triggering a coordinated ARVN and Cambodian strike. The aftermath revealed training manuals, weapons caches, and rosters listing hundreds of fighters. The mission had disrupted a potential staging ground for a future regional insurgency. Another operation in late 1972 saw SOG teams aiding in the defense of a CIA-affiliated hilltop station under siege by NVA forces. While officially off mission, the team volunteered to support, directing air support, providing sniper overwatch, and helping coordinate a last-minute exfil for American advisors. It was one of the last direct action engagements fought by SOG operators before formal drawdown orders arrived. Throughout this final phase, SOG's actions reflected a shift in mindset from high-risk individual raids to shaping long-term battlefield dynamics. They weren't just fighting the enemy anymore, they were trying to leave behind a self-sustaining network of resistance, or intelligence gathering and sabotage. The lessons learned during these years would become gospel for later units like Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, and JSOC task forces. Every tactic, every claymore trap, every silent LZ, every exfil under fire was studied and refined. SOG operators who later served in Delta or taught at Special Forces schools embedded these doctrines into the DNA of American special operations: fast insertion, precision sabotage, deep partnerships with local forces, intelligence-driven action, absolute deniability. These were not just practices, they were gospel. As the sun set on MACV-SOG's combat role, their shadow still moved across future battlefields. They had proven what was possible, that a small group of highly trained men using unconventional tactics could punch holes in enemy strategy, disrupt entire campaigns, and leave without a trace. And though the war itself was lost, the methods they pioneered would live on. When MACV-SOG was disbanded in 1972, its legacy didn't fade. It went underground, embedded in the DNA of America's future warriors. Though the unit had operated in total secrecy, the lessons learned in its brutal, silent war echoed through every Tier 1 operation that followed. SOG didn't just influence modern special operations, it built the prototype. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, the playbook of elite warfare was written in the blood, sweat, and silence of SOG recon teams. When Delta Force was founded in 1977, its architects looked directly at SOG for guidance. Charlie Beckwith, Delta's founder, had served with MACV-SOG during the height of the Vietnam War. He brought back more than just stories. He brought doctrine: how to build deniable units, how to conduct deep recon without support, how to run black operations under political constraints, and how to trust 6 men to change the course of a theater. Delta's initial training program included modules modeled on SOG's insertion methods, jungle movement, covert comms, and target identification techniques. More than tactics, it was mindset that carried forward. SOG operators had learned to operate in complete autonomy. No QRF, no backup, no extraction if things went sideways. That principle shaped the early years of Delta, and later, GSOC. Missions in Panama, Somalia, and Bosnia followed the same rhythm. Eyes on recon, small team direct action, rapid exfil. When Delta cleared the way for Rangers during Operation Just Cause, they did so using techniques born in the Laotian jungle: night insertion, rapid breach, targeted snatch, and instant withdrawal. In Iraq and Afghanistan, the fingerprints of SOG were everywhere. When Task Force 121 hunted high-value targets in Baghdad, they used blacked-out helicopters, ISR feeds, and human intel networks just like SOG had, with the same doctrine of own the night. Operators flooded buildings under NVGs, snatched suspects before they knew they'd been targeted, and exfiltrated within minutes. When JSOC built fusion cells in Balad and Bagram, they replicated SOG's habit of embedding intelligence analysts directly into operational planning, shortening the loop from recon to action. Even in gear and loadout, SOG's influence was visible. The modular packs, suppressed weapons, handheld radios, and short-barreled carbines carried by Tier 1 units in modern war zones evolved from the field modifications SOG teams made on their own in Vietnam. The rule had always been, if it doesn't help in contact, it doesn't come. That same ethos guided the gear rooms of Delta and DevGru, but it was the mentality, the deep, quiet aggression that stuck the longest. SOG operators had learned that success meant becoming ghosts, invisible, precise, brutal when necessary, and always several moves ahead. That became gospel for the men who hunted Zarqawi, who landed on Pakistani soil to kill bin Laden, who ran capture-kill operations in Syria. The tempo, the silence, the constant pivoting from recon to assault, those were SOG principles. Some of the most effective operations in the post-9/11 era directly mirrored SOG missions. During the surge in Iraq, Delta Force built intelligence webs in Mosul and Baghdad by capturing low-level facilitators and working up the ladder exactly as SOG had done with couriers on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Operators learned local languages, developed informants, and staged for weeks at safe houses before executing a strike. One former Delta operator said it plainly: "Every time we crossed into Syria or did a hit inside our city, we were living in SOG's shadow." Psychological operations also bore SOG's signature. SOG had forged documents, planted false intel, and used captured prisoners to seed misinformation techniques that modern units would later refine into full-spectrum information warfare. In Afghanistan, false raids were conducted just to make insurgents shift safe houses. In Iraq, fake IDs and forged cell phones were used to create phantom networks that drew enemy resources away from real operations. MACV-SOG also pioneered the concept of joint indigenous warfare, working hand in hand with local forces to build long-term capability. The Montagnard teams of SOG became the blueprint for today's partner force programs. Whether it was training Kurdish CTG units in Iraq or shepherding Afghan commandos, modern operators echoed the old SOG model. Train hard, fight beside them, earn their loyalty, and make them lethal. Legacy also came in the form of ethos. The SOG motto, silent, deadly professional, was never printed on banners, but it lived in every operator's kit. The respect for secrecy, the discipline under fire, the commitment to the mission, even at personal cost, these were values passed from generation to generation in whispered stories, in scars, and quiet nods during training. Some of the original SOG veterans would go on to teach at Bragg, Fort Lewis, or Dam Neck, shaping new classes without ever revealing what they'd done. But the method stuck. The rise of hybrid war and gray zone conflict only proved how far ahead SOG had been. Their missions had always occupied the space between war and peace, politics and combat. Today's special operations environment, where actions must be deniable, precise, and globally mobile, is a world SOG prepared America for. When operators infiltrate a foreign country to sabotage infrastructure or grab a financier, they follow a trail cut decades earlier through the jungle. Even the resurgence of small team warfare in the 2020s echoes SOG. The shift away from heavy footprints and big unit tactics has returned elite units to their roots. 6 to 8 man cells, long-range recon, surgical strikes, and close coordination with interagency and intelligence services. The modular kill chain that modern forces use sensors, shooters, analysts, cyber warfare is nothing more than an evolved version of what SOG did with map, radio, and gut instinct. And perhaps most of all, SOG left behind a culture of silence. No glory, no parade, just the mission. For years, their operations were buried in vaults, their names missing from rolls, their awards delivered under false units,